Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Robert Schmid. I am Deloitte Digital's Chief IoT Technologist, and also known as Mr. IoT. This week on Coffee with Mr. IoT, I am talking with Joe Mariani, one of our research experts, and we're going to talk about IoT and factual data and research and intelligence officers and all the fun stuff. Hey, Joe, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, Robert. I got my coffee and I'm ready to go.
Oh, awesome, awesome. Why did I talk about intelligence officers? What am I talking about?
Well, that's how I got my start. That was my first job out of college was being a Marine Corps intelligence officer. So it was an exciting one.
What does that mean? What do you do? And is there anything IoT related in that?
Actually, you know what? It's the first place I ever even learned about IoT, although it wasn't by that name. So, under the big heading of intelligence officer, you can do a lot of things, but basically it's all about information at some point, right? You're out there collecting information, you're reading it, you're analyzing it, you're making reports. But one of the things I did was I led this group called Ground Sensors. And we took little things like cameras and microphones and seismographs, and we would do silly things like hide them in rocks and put them on the side of the road. But you'd have this big network of sensors now that's out there, right? And that's starting to sound a lot like Internet of Things. And we had to get that information back and see it in a usable form and give it to decision makers so they could see where guys were placing roadside bombs, for example. And in fact, I didn't know it at the time. I wish I had things like the information value to try to figure out what Internet of Things was. But we found bottlenecks in there.
You want to have what figured out before? Say that again.
Oh, trying to find like the information value loop. Because we would come across these information bottlenecks. Like we'd have all the data coming in from the sensors, but we couldn't get it into a database. And so we'd have to basically hotwire all the sensors into databases and things like this. So if we had known what the Internet of Things were, it would have made us so much more efficient. It would have been great.
So you talk about data that you captured then, and much of that data is unstructured too, right? You must have had a problem of getting this unstructured data actually to search for, because I don't know, this sounds like it's more than 10 years ago, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in fact, some of the stuff we were working with was built in the Vietnam War, so built in the the early to mid 70s. And so to a certain extent, you'd have some structure to the data, but the big problem is you'd have lots of different structures of data, almost a typical Internet of Things problem. You'd have lots of different data standards. You have stuff from one manufacturer, stuff from another manufacturer, stuff made by the government itself. And trying to get all those things together and trying to see it in one place, that was a big challenge. And exactly as you said, 10 years ago, it required a lot of just back-end hot wiring of stuff just to try to even make it work.
So today you work for Deloitte and you are one of our research managers. You actually helped me a lot with getting data. And I know we talked about a week and a half or 2 weeks ago about agriculture and how IoT affects agriculture. Talk a little bit about what research is like for you. How does that work? And how do you actually, there's so much hype out there. How do you get factual data that's actually factually true?
Yeah, I think that's the biggest challenge, is trying to cut through a lot of what's out there and get down to something that's, not just factual, but kind of relevant to folks. And, I think when I go to a lot of conferences, one of the things I see is you see a lot of stuff that's almost like clickbait format, top 10 ways Internet of Things is going to change your life, top 5, new M&A ventures in IoT. You're like, hey, that's very interesting. It makes me want to go. But it ultimately doesn't really help people understand what's going on and underlying all these things. So one of the things we try to do is, go back to a lot of the academic literature. So, go back to some of the underlying theories of value, underlying theories of how firms work, underlying theories of how technologies all work and come together. And try to use those as kind of a jumping off point, because then we can go out and we can see all the different statistics that are out there. We can see all the different companies and what they're doing, and it can help us filter out which one of those are actually relevant, and which one of those are going to ultimately distill into some big theme that can help not just our clients but anyone really try to understand what's going on with IoT.
It's fascinating to me. My kids, I have a 17-year-old and a 19-year-old son, right? And they come to me and sometimes they say, Papa, I need to do this differential and integral stuff, and am I ever gonna use this? And I tell them, the most complicated math you'll do in business is percentage calculations. And how do you find when you do these interesting scientific studies? I remember one of the things I tried to do in the business world was Monte Carlo analysis, where you actually, instead of giving people one number, you give them a range of numbers based on percentages. And many people were just overwhelmed by that. How do you find when you do these scientific analysis? How do you distill it down to something that's generally consumable for people like me who haven't been doing math for 20 years?
Oh yeah, absolutely. In fact, I'm a philosophy major by background. I did a little bit of math, but I still struggle. In fact, my wife bought me a book recently. It's like the 7 Pillars of Statistical Wisdom. She's like, yeah, you read about some of this stuff. You should be great. I couldn't understand the first page. It was written by a Nobel Prize winner in statistics, and it was rough. So I think, yeah, to your point, that's a challenge for everybody. And I think what it comes down to is trying to put that data in the context of a story. The data is great on its own, but if it's just, out there as little points of light, it's not really helping you understand what's going on. But if you can, put it in an arc, help understand what the story is, where that stuff is pointing, then people can help out. And I think, your point about your kids is great, because I think, I have like a little toddler at home. You may be able to hear him in the background. But he's actually helped me create some of those stories about IoT to make it understandable. So, for example, the way we think about IoT is as a technology architecture, right? It's not a thing. It's not like your phone that you can hold as a device. It's a way of connecting these things together. And so we use the analogy of, hey, my toddler can undo a bucket of Legos and spill it out on the floor, but he can't put them all together in the right way to build like a house. And so the idea is, the devices, the sensors, the communication protocols, those are like the Legos, but Internet of Things is the directions that you follow to build the house itself up, do something completely new with those ingredients.
Interesting. Do you think that the fact, I've heard this before, data scientists are really hard to find. And this is what, you talked about the masses of data in IoT and how we need to pull together so much data. Do you think this is one of the entrance hurdles for IoT, that it's actually overwhelming for people to have all this data, and unless we really distill it down to some really simple stuff, it's really not consumable? Is that a problem, you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say, it's not just a problem from that data science perspective, but that kind of same issue you're describing, the choice overload. I have, so much to deal with. I don't know where to start. That's even a problem at the very front end of IoT that we're seeing, where there are, even think about just something similar or something small like connected home. There's not too many applications that you can put in a home. Security cameras, thermostats, door locks, things like that. But even then, there's so many choices out there. Picking the right ones for you is difficult, and that's why you see 6, 7 hubs come out just to try to make these things work together. And so I think that's a huge problem in the Internet of Things. Even to the extent where, if you look across all industries, the biggest single segment of revenue for IoT is not, device makers. It's not the sensor manufacturers, not chip makers. It's actually, folks like us, it's professional services firms. And our interpretation of that is that, people are looking out here, and exactly as you described, there's just so many choices. They're having trouble figuring it out, and they need someone from the outside to come in and help them figure that out. Now that'll change in 5, 10 years once people get a handle on it. Maybe once a true platform emerges, but.
Well, I always say think big, start small. And I try to appeal to many is just pick one example that gives you value and start small. It's not about solving everything at once, but start small, and then that'll be an entrance for you to get bigger and bigger. So I guess that's my suggested approach around this. But if you're just joining us, I am Robert Schmid, Deloitte Chief IoT Technologist, and you're watching Coffee with Mr. IoT. And today I have Joe Mariani with me, and we talk about research and IoT. So, Joe, you talked about creating a story. and you told me that you're actually going to New Zealand to talk about agriculture and how IoT can potentially double their output, government-sponsored program. So give me a good story. I want to hear you. You talk about your philosophy major and you talk about stories. Give us one of the great IoT stories. We all love to hear IoT stories.
Yeah, all right. I'll give you one that's actually, there's lots of things you can do already. In fact, I'll give you a free story before the real story, and that's tying together the IoT again with intelligence. Is I knew about Internet of Things in agriculture before I even knew anything about Internet of Things or agriculture, and it's from when we were going to Afghanistan. We would look up the current opium production, the poppy crop, and every year the United Nations estimates the opium crop in Afghanistan. I said, well, how are they doing this? They don't have guys walking around the entire country counting all the poppy plants, and they do it, basically through Internet of Things. They have a few GPS connected phones, but most of it is satellite imagery. They take visual spectrum and infrared, near infrared. They compare the two and are able to identify the specific spectral absorption of poppy plants compared to, say, wheat or okra or pomegranates. And so, that's Internet of Things doing agriculture, and that exists, and people use that today for crop estimates, trying to figure out how well their potatoes are growing, whether there's moisture damage. But I think the real interesting story, like you're talking about, an arc that points to the future, is kind of something that doesn't quite exist yet, and that's something I didn't know. Is in both New Zealand and the United States, there's already requirements to have livestock animals tagged with RFID. So they're born within 10 days, they're tagged with these RFID chips, and that continues with them. Every time they leave the farm, they're scanned and tagged all the way up until they're processed at a plant. But the issue we're seeing is the cost burden as a result of that falls on the farmers, right? They have to pay essentially for the tags, they have to do all the monitoring, it takes their time. And so it's really like 80% of farmers in New Zealand dislike this program, even though it's good for spotting disease and controlling outbreaks and things like that. But from our perspective, looking at it from an IoT perspective, we say, see, you started almost, they missed the think big step from your think big, start small, scale fast. And so they didn't realize if they just expanded that out a little bit farther, if they took that same kind of tracking and extended it all the way through to the customer, now they have kind of a chain of provenance, so they can assure people of the quality, assure people of its social responsibility, like dolphin safe or safe catch fish. And as a result, customers are, kind of willing to pay an extra bit for that, pay a premium for it. And so the customers themselves can then subsidize the IoT. So by linking the value chain of agriculture in this very specific way, you can create something that's a benefit not just to the farmers, increase efficiency, but also to the consumers who now get an entirely new product.
So what you're talking about is the solution looking at half the chain and looking at it from your existing kind of point of view gives you minimal value, but it had some pain associated with that. But if you extended this to the product that was created from that, and you actually were able to charge more, you actually had a new business model almost in place, and you could actually, through looking at by looking through the customer's lens, suddenly it was like, oh, now the value is way, way bigger than it was before. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think, we talked about that just in the context of agriculture there, but some of the other research we've done with MIT and the kind of yearly digital survey we do with them has pointed that that's kind of an issue across all the industries, where if you ask some of these tech leaders, CIOs, even in digital organizations that have IoT, say, hey, what are you going to do with that data in the next 2 to 5 years? Almost all of them will say, we're going to use it to increase efficiency. We're going to take what we're doing now and just do it better, faster, cheaper. And if you ask them that same question, say, well, what about making new revenue? Are you guys looking at that? Very, very small, the smallest percentage, around 24, 25%. And so I think that's exactly the idea. Think big, start small, scale fast is great, but you do have to think big. Internet of Things is technology architecture, which means, it's not like a hammer looking for a nail. It can do whatever you want. You have to start with your business need, your business goal, and don't just get trapped into kind of imitating what everyone else has done and only doing efficiency. There's so much else it can do if that's what you want it to do.
It's interesting. I remember I was talking quite a while ago about the customer 360 view, right? Getting the customer's view from all different angles. And what I had to realize pretty quickly is that that meant I'm actually suddenly starting to talk to every C-level person in the company. The CFO was interested in the financial aspect. The CMO was interested in demographics and marketing data. The CTO was interested in product use. But really, to get someone to really say, well, I want it all, that was almost at the CEO level. And so it was really difficult to actually get sponsors for ideas like this. And I got to believe that's true for much of this business process change and business model change. Much of that has to come from top down in order to make sense, because bottom up, often you run into the natural organizational structures. Have you seen any successful bottom-up approaches in your research?
I mean, I think there certainly are some. I think that the big thing you see is, from a conceptual standpoint, an architecture like IoT is all about the connections between technologies. And exactly what you're saying, the more connections you change, the more value you can create, because you're doing something that's even newer. But as a result, the more the inertia of the company is going to push back against that. There's some things you can do to make that work. But I think the interesting thing from the example you just described is, hey, you have to talk to the CFO and talk, maybe return on investment. You got to talk to the CIO and talk, legacy, integration, things like that. So everyone, even within the company, has their own little perspective. And now if you want to expand a little bit out further, integrate with distributors or suppliers or reach customers, everyone in that ecosystem has that same problem. And so that's one of the things we're looking at now in our research is, hey, you're in a big complex ecosystem, say healthcare, and you got to convince everyone in that ecosystem that this stuff is of value. You got to talk about patients, providers, hospitals, insurers, government regulators. And so you really got to think through what's the, as you're saying, what's their perspective, what's their value proposition for IoT, and then map out all the interdependencies and actually kind of start with one and follow the interdependencies around until you can actually convince that whole set that this Internet of Things application is of value and is worth pursuing for everybody.
So, you just spurred a question in me, and you talked about the patient, right? We have something we call the patient 360, where we put the patient again in the center. And in my example before, in the customer 360 for a company, it's pretty clear that the CEO is the person who actually has all aspects. Who is the CEO of the patient?
I think that's the big challenge about those ecosystems. So in talking with, I have a co-author on one of these articles, kind of examining Internet of Things in the medical ecosystem, and she's a doctor at one of the big hospitals here in Chicago. And that's exactly her point as well, is, hey, it's great to start with all these things, whether it's pharmaceutical companies or med device companies or insurers, but really the core interaction in healthcare is that patient provider, patient doctor interaction, and everything else kind of emanates out from that. And you're exactly right. There's no kind of single owner of that relationship, right? Because certainly it involves the doctor being able to do work, and it involves the patient actually doing what they're told in some case, which is always a challenge. But so it then kind of becomes incumbent on someone in that environment to kind of take on the role of tech champion and begin communicating to all these other folks. And sometimes that's going to be the doctor. Sometimes it's going to be the hospital system. Sometimes it may be, an outside stakeholder. Like in many of these cases, we're looking at the artificial pancreas in our research. And much of that is being driven and advocated by these patient advocacy groups, JDRF, things along those lines. And so I think it's just being aware of those themes and trends, right? That there's going to be a tech champion. There's going to have to articulate the value of the IoT to all the stakeholders involved in the ecosystem. Those are important because the details are going to change with whatever industry, whatever tech application you're dealing with.
So I said, I know I'm starting to slowly shift into almost I don't know if you call it politics, but it's definitely a philosophy kind of question. I sat next to the CEO. I flew to Orlando, and it was right after the hurricane basically skipped by the coast. And I asked him what he was doing. He says, well, I'm the CEO of a medical clinic company, and I'm visiting my clinics here that were actually in okay shape, but I wanted to say hi to my people. And then he explained to me, which was really amazing. He said to me, we are different. And what we do is we actually directly contract with companies. And those companies actually don't go through insurance, but we provide the full service. They go, and it's a direct relationship between the company and, as you said, in this case, the doctor. And they happen to have doctors in all kinds of areas. What do you think of that model? It was the first time I heard about it. What do you think about that model?
Yeah, I don't know. I'd have to sit back and think about it for a little bit. But I certainly think that, especially thinking from the Internet of Things perspective, there's definitely interesting roles for new entrants like that to come in, that aren't your typical healthcare players, that aren't insurers or med tech companies or pharmaceutical companies.
Pharmacies too. They own pharmacies, clinics, and then they outsource to high-end places like UCLA.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's interesting. And you can see it from the perspective of IoT, right? That because now we're tracking information in a way that's new and different, people that have expertise in dealing with that information, and whether that information is actual, healthcare data, what's my blood pressure, things like that, or like you're saying, some of the back office things about healthcare, where are all those medical records going? What are the bill rates? Those types of things. There's definitely roles for new entrants to come in there. And, if we think about IoT like that value loop, own one of those stages and really both bring value to people because they're doing something new, and also for them, extract a little value and make a good business out of it.
His statement to me was, which I loved, was our job, the best job we can do is keep people healthy. Mm-hmm. And the healthier we keep people, the lower my costs are. And man, I love that. That's just what I want. I want to have someone that looks out for me to be healthy and keeps supporting me in some ways or forms of fashion. So, hey, we're about at the end of it. I'm going to want to shift to something lighter. We've talked about some really deep stuff, and I really appreciate it. Give me your worst IoT example you've seen. I'd love to hear a fun story about something really bad or just some really funky story. I'd love to close on that.
Sure. I think my favorite IoT examples are the ones that aren't really even IoT, right? That they're like, oh, I have this app and you just type into it and that's IoT because it's on a phone, right? And I'm like, nah, I don't know. So I was giving a guest lecture at one of the universities here in Chicago this week. And I gave them my favorite example of something that's cool and something that's not IoT. And it's basically with the missions to the moon, Apollo, what do we do? 11, 12, 14. The astronauts took up these 14-inch by 14-inch mirrors, and they kind of scattered them around the moon. And for the past about 25 years, they've been shooting lasers from observatories on Earth, bouncing them off those 14-inch mirrors and measuring the returns, kind of get hyper accurate distances from the Earth to the moon. They're also able to see crazy things like parts of the moon were spinning slightly differently than other parts, so they could reason about the origin of the moon and things like that. And that's super cool, right? That's students love it. It's probably one of the coolest technologies out there. But my point to them was, that's an incredibly great technology, very fascinating, not IoT. Because if you think about the architecture of that, that's basically just like having a super big 500,000 mile long ruler. So the architecture is very simple. And so I think that's a great way to think about IoT then is, it's not about the whiz-bang technology, it's about the architecture. And you can have very simple technologies with really complicated architectures, and those are going to be the great things that bring value, 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and why we'll still be talking about this and hanging out on whatever the follow-on for Google Hangouts is in 10 years, still talking about IoT.
Well, I have to tell you, I love this conversation. It shows that you were one of the really great science professors out there. I could chat with you all day long, and it was one of my favorite topics in school, and you just reminded me of that. Thank you for that. I'm glad you were with us doing research. It looks like this coffee break is coming to a close. I want to thank you, Joe, for a great conversation. Thank you so much. And please join. Rachel will be back next week, and me again next Friday. 9 a.m. Pacific, noon Eastern, for another Coffee with Mr. IoT. And by the way, if you missed any part of today's conversation, you can watch the episode again on my YouTube channel. Joe, thank you so much. Have a good one.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.